Why hello there, and welcome back to Tabletop Ferox. Now, when it comes to games, there are some that you want to check out because you've heard good or interesting things about them from assorted people, or ones you want to check out because they just look like they have really interesting concepts or gameplay mechanics. And then there are the games that you just kind of want to check out because they have a weird name. This is one of those. Beach Bunny Bimbos, with blasters, was released in 1989 or 91. It can kind of be hard to get exact release dates for these things sometimes. By TTRPG Games, who you may know as the publishers of Bureau 13 and probably other things. Or rather, it was originally released in 1989 or 91 as a 64-ish page zine, and then re-released in 2001 as not just a PDF, but a PDF on CD. That's right, in 2001, you could place an order with TTRPG Games, and they would send you, through the mail, a CD with a PDF copy of Beach Bunny Bimbos with blasters and guest, which is another thing that is, I don't think, actually related to Beach Bunny Bimbos with blasters. And to me, that's just a really interesting look at the early days of digital distribution, because those are small files. They very easily could have emailed them to customers, but for some reason decided the best way to send them out was to burn a 2 megabyte PDF to a CD and send it through the mail. Anyway, then it was re-released in 2014, once again as a PDF on CD, but also as just a PDF digital download. And the 2014 version is the one that I will be reviewing because it is the most recent, and also just look at this beautiful disaster of a cover. Who wouldn't want to review this? And as for the differences between those three versions of the game, as far as I can tell, the 2001 version is just a scan of the original print version. Like, it doesn't even have searchable text. And then the 2014 version is a page-for-page recreation of that original book. So it does have searchable text, and a few other unfortunate updates. And obviously I do not have that original 89-91 print edition, which is why I am unclear on some of the details, like the release date. In the 2001 and 2014 versions, there is a listed original edition copyright date of 1989. But then in the 2001 version, there is also a 1991 copyright date on the character sheet. So, one of three things happened. Either A, the game was written in 1989 and then not published until 1991, when that character sheet was added. B, the game was written and published in 1989, and then for the 2001 re-release, they just included this 1991 character sheet. Or C, the entire thing was written and released in 1991, but the digital re-releases have a copyright date of 1989 as an error, because the copyright notice was just copied from a different game, possibly Duck Trooper, but they were putting out a lot of digital editions in 2001. And yes, that doesn't really matter. I just want you to understand how much effort I put into researching even something like Beach Bunny Bimbos with blasters. A game that really caught my attention because the idea of a bimbo-centric role-playing game from this 89-91 period is very interesting, because I, and a lot of the people I associate with, and presumably a lot of people watching this video, have a very specific and generally non-derogatory definition of the word bimbo. But someone making a game in 1989 would have had a very different opinion of what a bimbo is. Just for reference, let's pull up my 1999 Webster's Dictionary, which defines bimbo as an attractive but stupid young woman, especially one with loose morals. So, that's what the dictionary says a bimbo was in 1999, but the issue is that people didn't only use it for that dictionary definition. It was just one of the more popular generic terms that you would throw at any woman you wanted to degrade, which, was something of a national pastime in the 80s and 90s. So, with this loose Gen X boomer definition of bimbo, how do you work that into the core idea of a game? How do you define a bimbo and then give them a blaster and make that something that supports an entire game? And of course, the even more important question, am I putting way too much thought into the definition of the word bimbo and how someone in 1989 would have interpreted that word when putting it into their stupid little joke game? And I'll tell you right now, the answer to that question is yes, but as for the other questions, well, you'll have to watch till the end to find out. That's a thing. It's a thing that we YouTubers say. Beach Bunny you know what, I'm just gonna call it Bimbos and Blasters because that is actually the name of the game. Like, every time the text references the game itself, it is by the name Bimbos and Blasters. So, that's what I'm going to call it. And weirdly enough, if anything, that Beach Bunny Bimbos with Blasters name is some kind of weird response to macho women with guns and possibly bat-winged bimbos from hell. Like, you put those titles together, change some of the words, and you have Beach Bunny Bimbos with Blasters. Which is directly referenced by this book and is a very, very weird flex, which is unfortunately representative of the whole of this game. Anyway, Bimbos and Blasters is set in a world where Martians have been secretly invading Earth for several years, replacing and or disguising themselves as humans and then just kind of setting up shop amongst us. And you, the player, take on the role of a human resistance fighter, one of the few who have been made aware of the Martian invasion, and now must the hunter become the hunted, or something like that. And while a scenario where the protagonists are part of an underground militia devoted to eliminating the aliens who are replacing humans, moving into their neighborhoods and eating their cats, has what could be conservatively called bad vibes, that's not the thing I really want to talk about, because this game has some other even weirder takes. Like, how does one identify a Martian? Well, obviously, because of their bad taste and their love of disco, polyester, and lawn flamingos, as well as things like attending PTA meetings and hating science fiction, gaming, and imaginative hobbies. But really, the disco, lawn flamingos, and polyester are the big three that they just keep hammering on as this game's one joke. And it just has this feeling of an unpopular teenager desperately trying to fit in by coming up with a list of things that they think are like totally lame, dude. And all they can do is try to imagine what an adult would like, and all they came up with is things that were popular in the 70s and or boring to me, the, loser teenager who thinks they're cool. Honestly, that's why I didn't make a bigger deal about the xenophobic Turner-esque scenario. This is one of those rare situations where I really get the impression that the author is just repeating things that they have seen in other media or heard other people say, while being completely oblivious to any implications that they may have. Somewhat like a young child repeating things that they heard a parent or older sibling saying. They don't know what they're saying, but it makes them feel cool to say it. And at this point, you might notice that I've mentioned Martians and underground resistance, but I've yet to say anything about beaches, bunnies, bimbos, or blasters. I mean, presumably the Martians have blasters, but I have yet to mention the other three because, honestly, the game barely mentions them. So when you first heard Beach Bunny Bimbos with blasters, you probably had the mistaken opinion that you would either be fighting or playing as Beach Bunny Bimbos with blasters, but it really seems like that is not the case, and the game more positions the Beach Bunny Bimbos as allies of the player characters, due to their unique bimbostic ability to see through Martians' disguises for some reason, because they're dumb, I guess. Seriously, this paragraph is the only part of the book that mentions beaches, beach bunnies, or bimbos, aside from getting an experience reward for working with beach bunnies, further suggesting that the intent of the game is that you will be playing as generic rugged action gunman and not boobular beach bimbos, despite the fact that the art in the book primarily focuses on the latter. So a -1 for concept, and it might not seem like the concept is so bad from what I have presented, but it's not about what is presented, it's about what isn't. Basically, this is a game that presents a premise, but then puts almost no thought or effort into exploring that premise. Like, the vision of the game that the designer seems to have had starts with you kicking down the door and ends with a final body hitting the ground, without considering anything that happens before or after that. Especially the fact that your group of human freedom fighters, to all outward appearances, seem like a murderous gang who is just randomly eliminating entire households and raiding them for supplies. A concept that should be incredibly important to the game, but the game itself seems to be almost entirely unaware of. In a way, it's kind of like violence, but with a complete lack of self-awareness. Also, things like exposing the Martian invasion never come up. Like, the designer didn't consider that players might try and do that, or that all of the Martian bodies they are leaving laying around might raise some questions. And of course the fact that bimbos, the most prominent thing in both of the game's titles, are barely featured and even less essential to the actual game, and seem like they were just included at all to justify having that eye-catching title, which, admittingly, did get me to look at the game and get you to watch the video, so I guess it did work, but I still don't approve. As mentioned, the rules do not only not require you to be a Beach Bunny Bimbo, but seem to not want you to, but do stop short of ever explicitly saying that you can't be one. So, of course, I am going to make a Beach Bunny Bimbo character because that's what I want to do and nobody can stop me. And for reasons that will be obvious later, I am actually going to go in exactly the order that the book says this time, instead of, whatever order I feel like, which is usually the way I do it. So first, name. And how about Sandy Shores? That's probably a realistic enough name. Like, seriously, what made the designer of Bimbos and Blasters decide to tell players of all things to make sure that their character name was realistic, when so many other important things in this game are just completely not considered? How do you deal with the fact that the authorities are actively hunting for you as a gang of murderous outlaws? Don't worry about it, but make sure your name is realistic. Then occupation, which is specified as being what you did before the Martians invaded Earth, because as mentioned, all characters are part of the underground resistance / murderous gang. However, because I don't really care about their poorly defined scenario, I am going to say that this character is actually a secret operative, maintaining a life in human / Martian society to better use her bimbo powers to identify the Martians, and therefore requires an occupation with good access to the general public. So I'm going to say bartender. And your occupation also gets listed as your primary skill, and I will just tell you now that that is a definition which means absolutely nothing and is never mentioned again. Then age, sex, height, and weight, and since it's not really all that important anyway, unlike having a realistic name, I guess I'll just go with 41, female, 5'5", and 135 pounds. And characters have 7 statistics, each of which are rolled with 4d10, so 18 strength, 26 constitution, 19 agility, 23 dexterity, 21 accuracy, 28 stealth, and 14 body points. Then you get 100 points to add to those, plus 1 for each year of age over 21. That's right, I get extra points for making a MILF. It's always fun when something is only balanced by the designer and imagined players' insecurities. And then I'm going to put 40 points in accuracy, 20 in agility and body points, and 10 in strength, constitution, dexterity, and stealth. Characters then get 10 additional skills, in addition to their primary skill, which is different in absolutely no way, which are selected from a list, or you can just make up your own, but I prefer to stick with what is provided for the purpose of showing you, the viewer, what is provided. Also, when I say list, I mean literally just a list of skills with no explanation or rules for anything. Like, there are rules for basic and heavy-duty medical skills, but zero indication of what skills count for those or what qualifies a character to be treated as a doctor. Can I just say my character's a doctor and take those skills? Is that allowed? I don't know, but the important thing is that I chose a name that was realistic. But, whatever. And just like statistics, each of our skills starts at 4d10, but this time we get 200 points to add to those, along with, once again, 1 additional point per year of age over 21. And there are no rules for aging or anything, these are just free points that you get for not being afraid to make your character old. So just spend those points and move on to equipment. And you may choose one weapon from the following lists: pistol, rifle, or shotgun. You have it. With your weapon, you have D100 plus 10 rounds. Any further weapons must be searched for or stolen from the Martians. The same goes for equipment, food, and medicine. More on that later. So I guess I'll just go with a sporting shotgun, which comes with 74 rounds and deals 6d10 plus 6 damage. For some reason, all guns deal xd10 plus x damage. Has a capacity of 2. YouTube probably would not like the joke I'm thinking of making right here. And a number of attacks per round of 1. And that's it really. So this character is done. So that was character creation, and it definitely was a character creation system. Like, a system that you could use to make a character in a game. Just not like anything that really feels specific to this game. And I will say, this is kind of like an overall problem with role-playing games from the 80s and 90s, and 2000s and 2010s and currently a tendency to just kind of throw a bunch of skills at the player that they could use to make a character for a game, instead of just giving them the specific set of skills that their character will use in that specific game. Like this game, Bimbos and Blasters has around 220 listed skills, which is just slightly more than Fatal. And when your game is less well focused than Fatal, you have a serious issue. And the skill selection is also weirdly broad while also not including a lot of basic skills. Like, the listed skills include accounting, ceramics, knitting, and marketing, but no kind of basic social skills like bluff, diplomacy, detect lies, or, the kinds of things that you might use when trying to sniff out a Martian invasion. Unless all of that is supposed to be covered by a single espionage skill. Now, as I said, you can just choose those skills yourself. You are not limited to the list they give you, but if you are not limited to the list they give you, and you can just come up with whatever skills you want, why is the list 4 pages long? Why did they spend that much space on something that is effectively not necessary at all for the game? So, as much as it hurts me to say this, 3 out of 6 for character creation. It's not good, but it's only kinda bad. It makes a character, just not a character that is in any way unique or specific to the game Bimbos and Blasters. Alright, so now that we have our Beach Bunny Bimbo, let's take a look at what she can do. Or, what she can do that I can show you on YouTube. So let's say that Sandy is tending bar when an unremarkable fellow saunters up and orders what would someone who desperately wants to be cool in 1991 think was a lame drink? A Harvey Wallbanger. Which, combined with her natural Beach Bunny Bimbo powers, allows her to determine that this customer is in fact a grody Martian. However, pulling out a shotgun and blowing his head off right here could draw some unwanted attention, so for the time being she just plays it cool and makes the drink, rolling percentile dice against her bartending skill with a success on a roll under the skill value. And that means that I now have to go on a whole weird thing. Statistic and skill values are both referred to as percentages, suggesting that the listed values are your percentage chance of succeeding. But also, as I just said, you succeed on a roll under that value. Now, you are most likely used to percentile rolls succeeding on a result less than or equal to the target, and also reading a result of double zeros as 100, a range of 1 to 100. However, if success happens only on a result less than but not equal to the target, like here, what it's going to do is shift all the actual probabilities to the listed probability -1. So if you want to maintain that listed probability, you need an extra number at the low end of the range, which is accomplished by reading double zeros as 0, a range of 0 to 99. And of course this book doesn't explain that, and actually exclusively refers to the dice as D100s, making that 1 to 100 reading seem much more correct. Also, I think this might be the earliest, if not only, game I've seen that specifically suggests using an actual D100. And yes, that is only an issue if you roll double zeros, a literal 1% chance, but I still want you, the viewer, to understand this very specific quirk of percentile dice and the two ways in which they were not always consistently implemented in earlier games, in case you happen to encounter this specific issue in the wild. Also, as someone who literally wrote a book on dice mechanics, I also just kind of like explaining dice mechanics. Although it is a little weird that this is the second consecutive video in which I have had to explain this specific thing. Anyway, as I was saying, roll under the value equals a success and one adequately made Harvey Wallbanger. But now, Sandy needs to figure out a way to deal with this Martian without also blowing her cover. Perhaps if she could think of some way to lure the Martian to an isolated location where she could deal with him without the voyeuristic gaze of the public. Maybe something along the lines of, oh my god, that medallion is like so choice. Disco's like totally rad. You know, you seem like a really cool guy. You wanna like meet me out back after my shift or something? And roll, I don't know, carousing? As I said, there is no deception or seduction skill to speak of, so let's just say that carousing covers it because I need to roll something, and success. So the Martian falls for the very clever ploy and shows up at the specified place and time, likely expecting that something else is going to get blown, but instead finds himself faced with a Beach Bunny Bimbo with blaster. Where did she get a blaster pistol? I don't know, but if I made a video on Beach Bunny Bimbos with blasters and did not include at least one Beach Bunny Bimbo with blaster, I would be doing a disservice to my audience. And as the Martian was definitely not expecting this Beach Bunny Bimbo to have a blaster, I am going to say this counts as an ambush, meaning that she gets 2 free rounds to attack. And to make a blaster attack, or any projectile weapon attack, you roll versus accuracy, in this case 61. And a blaster pistol deals 5d10 damage, has a capacity of 100, which I don't think I'm going to have to worry about for this example, and can fire 1 to 3 shots per round. And I think she's going to take advantage of that high firing speed and shoot 3 times. So roll and miss, hit, and hit for 60 damage. Or rather, it would be 60 damage, if not for the Martianess Chitin, which has an armor value of 1 versus high velocity attacks, so reduces the damage from each attack by 1. However, the remaining 58 damage is still enough to take the Martian down to -1 body points, which means he's, like, totally wasted, dude. So that was combat, and at this point you might find yourself wondering why at no point did I use or even mention the projectile weapon skill, and that is because it isn't used, and I don't mean it's not used for making a ranged attack, I just don't think any of the combat skills are actually used for anything, with the notable exception of martial arts, which is not only the only combat skill to have specific rules associated with it, but the only skill in the entire game of any kind that has specific rules associated with it. Like, as mentioned, all range attacks just use accuracy, and all of the listed melee attacks use either dexterity or agility. The only specification about melee weapons is that they deal different damage from unarmed attacks, and blade is even listed on the physical combat table using dexterity. And could I invent a reason to use those skills, come up with some reading of the rules that almost suggests a situation in which you would need to roll hand-to-hand combat or improvised weapons? Yes, I could, but so could have the original designer, and they didn't, so why should I? However, they did actually include some other rules, which I will now just run through to give you a rough idea of what was considered important enough to include, despite all of the things that were not. So as you've already seen, body points are hit points, But Constitution is also hit points, just hit points against specific effects, like asphyxiation and atmospheric damage. But then there's also rules for things like armor breaking, hit location, bone breaking, knocking out, diseases, electricity, explosions, fire, falling, having things fall on you, radiation, starvation, extreme temperatures, toxins, vehicle impacts, and of course the rules for searching unoccupied structures for supplies, which, as mentioned, are more likely to be suburban homes than abandoned farmhouses. And just to be catty about it, most of these rules, like the core rules, are just bad, haphazardly thrown together at best and incomplete at worst. Like, those searching rules say that searching increases characters' chance of being surprised and slows their reaction to an ambush, something that sounds an awful lot like it should have some kind of rules associated with it, but no, of course it doesn't. Also, the table for random finds has 2 different entries for 80 in Remember, the 2014 re-release. And it's just like a quantity of rules, and it feels like that was the goal, just to have rules for things without any regard as to if those rules were functional, necessary, or even wanted. But I can complain more about that later, and will. But for now, for defeating the Martian, Sandy gets experience points. How many experience points? Well, let's say 2 points for good judgment and sound reasoning, 2 points for effective use of weapons, 2 points for outwitting Martians, 2 points for playing in character, which I did beautifully, 2 points for no casualties, well, no human casualties, 2 points for working with beach bunnies. Being a beach bunny means that I am always working with a beach bunny, and 1 point for disposing of a civilian Martian, for 13 points total, which can be spent to increase statistics and skills on a 1-to-1 basis, and I'm just going to dump those all in accuracy, because, as I kinda pointed out, accuracy, dexterity, agility, and body points are the stats that combat runs on, and combat is really the only thing that the rules actually consider. Like, I guess you could invest in martial arts and a medical skill, but once you understand the specific way this game doesn't work, you're really better off just maxing those out at character creation, since they give you 200 points. And those were the mechanics, and just like with character creation, it is a set of mechanics for a game, just not anything that feels specific to this game. And I think, once again, it is down to a lack of focus. Like, this game does not seem to know what it wants to be, and that kind of makes it impossible to make a set of mechanics that serve that game. Like, at a casual glance, it really seems like this is supposed to just be a fun, silly little game. Beach bunny bimbos with blasters, haha, that's so silly, disco is lame, yeah. But if that's what it's supposed to be, then the core rules feel a bit too clunky, and also the inclusion of rules for things like starvation, suffocation, bone breaking, and supply raids seem a little unnecessary. On the other hand, if it's supposed to be some big, ongoing, simulationist combat survival scenario, then A, the tone is way too silly for that, and B, the mechanics just do not have the necessary depth to be satisfying in that kind of experience. As I kind of said, there are a lot of things that there are mechanics for, but those mechanics aren't, like, good. And it just has this feeling of a design process of, ooh, what about that, and this, and that, and just adding things because you thought of things to add, not because they were things that the game needed. So a 2 out of 6 for mechanics. Somehow both too complicated and too simple for the game that they are supposed to support, whatever that game happens to be. So a lot of times with these smaller games, you run into an issue where there just isn't space to include enough necessary content. And other times, you run into the opposite problem where there isn't enough space, but they put all the stuff in anyway. As mentioned, this game has more listed skills than Fatal, only one of which actually has specific rules, making the entire 4-page skill section basically just a list of things that the designer thinks could be skills in a role-playing game, as well as 19 pages of armor, weapons, and vehicles in, remember, a 62-page booklet. And as I have said before, no game needs 21 different handguns, but especially one where the rules are fairly simplistic. Like, just for another point of reference, D20 Modern, another game that I specifically called out for having too many handguns, only had 17. And yes, some players do actually care about having a glut of mechanically redundant specific firearms in their role-playing game. But those players are not playing Bimbos and Blasters, they're playing Recon or something like that. They do also provide a short adventure, like really short, just a basic setup and a map, and like the rest of the game, really fails to consider the intricacies of the situation, where you are expected to go into a shopping mall to identify and kill 8 specific people who only you know are Martians. So, no adjustment for content. There is a lot of stuff that you do not need, taking up space that probably could have been used for much more important content, but that doesn't really make the game worse, just prevents it from being better. As for the writing, it's fine-ish. The handful of mechanics that are actually here are competently explained, but it does suffer from a problem that a lot of role-playing games, I want to say from the 80s, but just in general, do suffer from, and that is a severe tonal shift between explaining the premise and explaining the mechanics. Once you get to character creation, any comedic tone or really acknowledgement of the premise of the game just kind of vanish until you get to the NPC section. And even then, when they do actually explain the premise, the comedic tone that they go for comes across much more just juvenile and angry. Like, disco is stupid, polyester is stupid, this is stupid, that is stupid, you're stupid, everyone's stupid except me. It just has this angry teenager vibe to it. And then also things like just randomly including these attempted digs at the EPA and ACLU, and as I said, just this feeling of a child repeating things that they heard a parent say. Honestly, I'm kind of glad that this game is so completely unable to make a coherent statement, because if it did, it would probably be some kind of sad, edgy 80s conservatism. However, I will admit that there is one decent piece of writing in this book, and that is the full-page in-character introduction to the adventure, which comes from the character Mitzi, presumably a beach bunny bimbo, although never stated because, as I said, that is only ever mentioned in one paragraph, who speaks in a way that is just constantly punctuated with like and you know and that kind of junk. And honestly feels like the only piece of writing in this entire book that had any effort put into it. Also, it just kind of amuses me because, as you have either noticed or are about to notice right now, that's kind of how I talk. It's just like, you know, a dialect for sexy people. So, no adjustment for writing. It is lacking for the most part, and at times insufferable with its weird obsession with lawn flamingos and polyester, but not so bad that it hurts the overall game. possibly because the game sets such a low bar. So, as mentioned, this book was originally published as a 5.5 by 8.5 inch zine, and for a product of that level and that time, it is fairly well done. So, some single column text with basic headings and tables broken up by images, and those illustrations are pretty much the only thing maintaining some level of tone and theming throughout the whole book, and look pretty good. Or they did look pretty good. Here's the thing. The illustrations in the 2014 version look absolutely horrible, especially when you compare them to the way they looked in the previous versions, which, while a little rough, were still very clean and readable. Like, can you tell what's going on in this illustration? How about now? One of those is better than the other, and it's not the one that has been photoshopped to death. All of the coloring here has a very strong My First Photoshop feel, with everything just being bombarded with highlights and shadows and gradients and patterns and photos that make everything just look muddied and destroy any charm or clarity that the original illustrations had. And it's not just poor aesthetic choices, those choices are executed poorly. Like, most of the images have these white halos around the lines because, I guess, blend modes are hard, and for some reason they refuse to edit the original illustrations in any way. Like these bullet holes in the sky, which would have been very, very easy to erase, or not recropping any of the images where the original lines did not go all the way to the border, instead just filling in that space with blobs of color. And it is just very perplexing to me that they would go through the trouble of applying this entire eye-bleed nightmare, but not the trouble of learning some basic digital coloring techniques. Because remember, this was 2014, and as someone who has been doing digital art since 2010 and digital coloring since way before then, I can tell you that at this point, if you had access to these tools, you also had access to huge amounts of free training on how to use them. So, 3 out of 6 for presentation. I mean, it's not unbearable, but does kind of make you want to specifically seek out the 2001 version. And that was Bimbos and Blasters, aka Beach Bunny Bimbos with Blasters. A game, I guess. Specifically though, one that seems to be trying to straddle the line between fun, lighthearted romp and serious simulationist combat survival game. A line that is so wide that it's kind of a meaningless position to occupy, like saying I live somewhere between California and Maine. And it feels a little bit like they were trying to make War of the Worlds, but then for some reason decided to present it as Bart versus the Space Mutants, because at times it seems like the game that is being described is one where your ragtag group of human resistance fighters are running around and hiding out and scavenging for supplies in the ruins of bombed out cities. And then at other points it's just like, OMG you guys, there's like Martians at the mall and junk. And those two things do not gel together well. Overall, it seems like much less a game than it is a concept for a game. A concept that was almost immediately abandoned in favor of just listing as many things as possible. And usually when I am looking at even a bad game, I like to think that I can see the potential, see how it could have been better if they had done things differently. But in this case, I really don't. It seems like the core concept was just never even developed to a point where it could really support a game. This game has two goals and two real selling points: having a silly title and containing hundreds of skills, weapons, equipment, and vehicles. And it really doesn't seem like there was any effort or really desire to go above or beyond meeting those two very low criteria. And thank you for watching. If you enjoy my sassy wit, art, and saucy euphemisms, you can follow me on Blue Sky and Tumblr, or catch me streaming on Twitch occasionally, just, not very often. Also, there is a Discord now because people kept asking me if there was a Discord, and now there is. Links to all of that in the description. And as always, an extra special thanks to my Fightin' Flail Snails: Broken Unicorn, D-Stex, Diablade, Nikolai Snowtail, Puggo, Randy Mulholland, Ramogus, Renee D, Stephen Hafner, Stephen Kramer, Tila Glar, Toshiro Kuro, and Tyro the Fox. If you want to be cool like them, check out my Patreon or channel memberships. Two different things that provide similar but distinct benefits because they are on different platforms that only offer different benefits. But if you don't want to do that, that's cool too. You can still hit all the lovely buttons, like, subscribe, smash the buttons, whatever they are. Or, maybe click on one of these other videos that has mysteriously manifested from the ethers, which I am sure are lovely videos that you will also enjoy. And I will see you next time.